It was a quiet evening on the edge of the city. Officer Daniels, a seasoned police officer, was on patrol, his car slowly rolling through the streets. The bright red and blue lights on his cruiser flickered as he watched the traffic, searching for any signs of trouble. The streets were calm, and he almost thought his shift would pass without anything unusual. Then he noticed a car with a slightly broken taillight. It wasn't a big issue, but protocol required him to pull the driver over. Daniels flipped on his lights and signaled for the car to stop. The vehicle, a modest sedan, smoothly pulled over to the side of the road. As Daniels approached, he adjusted his belt and prepared for the interaction. Inside the car sat a woman in her mid-30s. She was neatly dressed in a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a clean bun. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel, her calm demeanor immediately catching Daniels' attention. This wasn't the usual nervous or hurried driver he'd often encountered. Instead, she sat there as if she already knew what was coming. Daniels knocked on the window, and the woman rolled it down. "Good evening, ma'am," he said in a firm but polite tone. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The woman, Angela Thompson, met his gaze with a calm expression. "Good evening, officer. I assume it's because of my taillight," she replied evenly, her voice steady. Daniels was slightly surprised by her confidence, but didn't show it. "Yes, Mom, your rear taillight is out. Can I see your license and registration?" Angela nodded without hesitation. "Of course, officer." She reached into her bag slowly, making sure her movements were clear. She handed over her documents with a polite smile. Daniels noticed her composure. It wasn't something he saw often. As Daniels took the papers back to his car to check them, Angela sat quietly, her mind racing. She had been in situations like this before. She knew the importance of staying calm, even when her heart whispered reminders of past encounters. But Angela wasn't the type to let fear control her. She believed in handling every situation with dignity and respect, even when others might not offer her the same. In the patrol car, Daniels ran Angela's information. Everything came back clean. Her license was valid, her car was registered, and there were no outstanding issues. Still, something about her calmness stuck with him. He had expected nervousness, excuses, or perhaps frustration. Instead, Angela had treated him with respect, despite the inconvenience of being pulled over. When Daniels returned to the car, Angela was still sitting there, waiting patiently. She wasn't on her phone or tapping her fingers impatiently. She just sat, calm and steady. Daniels handed back her papers. "Everything checks out, ma'am. I suggest you get that taillight fixed as soon as possible. Have a good night." Angela's response was unexpected. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate you letting me know." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and nodded respectfully. Daniels hesitated for a moment, almost unsure of what to say. There was something about her calmness, her dignity, that made him think. As he walked back to his car, he realized this wasn't just another routine stop. Something about Angela had left an impression, and he couldn't quite figure out why. As Angela drove away from the traffic stop, the city lights blurred into the background of her thoughts. The encounter had been calm, yet it lingered in her mind. She had handled it the same way she approached most challenges in life, with patience and respect. But she couldn't help but reflect on the patterns she'd experienced before. She had grown accustomed to being treated differently, not always because of what she did, but simply because of who she was. Angela shook her head and focused on the road ahead. There were bigger things to think about tonight. She was on her way to the community shelter where she volunteered every week. It was her way of giving back, of helping those who didn't have the opportunities she'd worked so hard to create for herself. She parked her car outside the old brick building and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The shelter was a warm, bustling place filled with people from all walks of life. Families gathered around tables, sharing meals. Children laughed and played in the corner, their voices echoing off the walls. Angela greeted the staff and volunteers with her usual kind smile before rolling up her sleeves to help serve dinner. Meanwhile, Back in his patrol car, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the interaction with Angela. He'd pulled over countless drivers in his career, yet something about her demeanor had stuck with him. Her calmness, her confidence, it was unusual, and it made him think. He realized he had approached the stop with his own assumptions, expecting frustration or defensiveness. Instead, Angela had met him with dignity and composure. Daniels leaned back in his seat, replaying the moment in his mind. Why had it left such a mark? He thought about his reasons for joining the force years ago. He had wanted to serve, to make a difference in his community. Yet somewhere along the way, the daily grind had dulled that sense of purpose. He had grown more guarded, more automatic in his judgments. Tonight, Angela had reminded him of something important. People were individuals, not just the situations they found themselves in. Back at the shelter, Angela moved with ease through the room, offering warm words to everyone she met. She had a natural gift for connecting with people, for making them feel seen and valued. One of the children tugged at her sleeve, and she crouched down to listen to his excited story about the drawing he had made in school that day. Her laughter filled the room, a bright sound that lifted the spirits of everyone around her. Later that evening, as Angela drove home, she thought about the officer again. She didn't hold any bitterness about the stop, though she wished things could be different. In her heart, she hoped her calm approach had planted a small seed of change. Unbeknownst to her, it already had. Daniels was still in his patrol car, staring out into the night. He thought about Angela's response and how it had challenged his perspective. He didn't know her name, but he knew he wouldn't forget her. And so, two lives moved forward, each carrying a small but powerful piece of the other. The next morning, Officer Daniels sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The events of the previous night were still on his mind. He had been on the force for years, and yet he couldn't shake the image of Angela's calm, steady demeanor. It wasn't just her politeness. It was the way she carried herself, as though she refused to let anything break her spirit. Daniels had seen so many faces in his career. Some were filled with anger, some with fear, and others with frustration. But Angela's expression had been different, one of quiet strength. It wasn't something he could easily explain, but it had made him think deeply about his role as a police officer. At the same time, Angela was preparing for another busy day. She had an important meeting with a group of community leaders to discuss a new program for the shelter. As she gathered her notes, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend who had heard about her encounter with the officer. "You handled it better than I would have." The message read, followed by a laughing emoji. Angela smiled faintly and replied, "Calm minds make better decisions. It wasn't worth losing my peace over." For her, staying calm in situations like that was a choice. It wasn't always easy, but she knew that reacting with anger wouldn't solve anything. Angela believed in being an example, even when it was hard. Meanwhile, at the police station, Daniels was still reflecting on Angela's response. He mentioned the encounter to one of his colleagues, Officer Kelly, during their break. "She was different," Daniels said, leaning back in his chair. "Most people either get defensive or frustrated, but not her. It was like she was teaching me something without saying it." Kelly raised an eyebrow. "Teaching you something? That's new. Usually, you're the one handing out the lessons," she said with a chuckle. Daniels nodded thoughtfully. "I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like she was challenging me to be better, without even trying. Made me think about how I approach people." Kelly tilted her head, her expression curious. "Sounds like she got to you, Daniels. Maybe it's time we both take a step back and look at how we do things." The conversation stuck with Daniels throughout the day. As he patrolled the streets, he found himself paying closer attention to the people he interacted with. He noticed their expressions, their tones, their body language. He wondered how many times he had made assumptions based on quick judgments rather than truly seeing the person in front of him. Back in her world, Angela's meeting went well. The leaders were excited about her ideas, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose as she left the room. She thought about how much change could happen when people worked together with kindness and understanding. It was a belief she held onto, no matter how the world around her behaved. That day, two paths continued to move forward. Daniels was beginning to see his job in a new light, and Angela remained unwavering in her mission to create positive change. Though their worlds were different, a small spark of transformation connected them, setting the stage for what was yet to come. The afternoon sun was setting as Angela walked into the small cafe near the shelter. She had promised one of her mentees, Lisa, that they would meet to discuss Lisa's plans for the future. Lisa was a bright teenager with a sharp mind, but carried the weight of too many struggles for someone her age. Angela had taken her under her wing, hoping to guide her toward a brighter path. Lisa was already seated at a corner table, her notebook open and her pen tapping nervously against the page. Angela approached with her warm, calming smile. "Sorry I'm late, Lisa. How's it going?" Lisa shrugged, her expression unsure. "I've been trying to write my college essay, but nothing sounds good. I feel like it doesn't matter what I write. Who's going to care about someone like me?" Angela sat down, her eyes soft with understanding. "Lisa, your story matters more than you know. You've overcome so much already. Sharing your experiences can inspire others. You have a voice, and it deserves to be heard." Lisa hesitated, then nodded slowly. Angela's words always had a way of breaking through the doubt. They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, with Angela gently guiding Lisa toward discovering her strengths. By the time they were done, Lisa was smiling, a small but genuine smile that hinted at growing confidence. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was wrapping up another patrol shift. His interactions that day had been different. He had made an effort to engage people with more patience, asking questions instead of making assumptions. To his surprise, he found the responses he received were more positive. Small moments of kindness, he realized, could change the entire tone of a conversation. As Daniels drove back to the station, he passed by the same shelter Angela had visited earlier. The sight made him slow down, his thoughts drifting back to her. He wondered if he'd ever see her again. There was something about her calm strength that lingered in his mind, urging him to learn more, not just about her, but about the kind of person she represented. Angela, on the other hand, was unaware of the officer's reflections. She was busy helping Lisa gather her things and encouraging her to keep working on her essay. As they stepped outside the cafe, the cool evening air greeted them. Angela walked Lisa to the bus stop, making sure she felt safe and supported before heading home herself. On her drive home, Angela couldn't help but reflect on the challenges young people like Lisa faced every day. It was why she did what she did, to be a steady hand in a world that often felt unstable. She thought about her own mentors, people who had believed in her when she doubted herself. Now, it was her turn to pass that belief on to others. As the day ended, both Angela and Daniels found themselves thinking about the power of connection. Angela knew that small acts of kindness could ripple out in ways she might never see. Daniels, for the first time in years, began to wonder if he could make a similar impact in his role. Though they were miles apart, the seed of change continued to grow within both of them. The following week, Officer Daniels found himself sitting in his car outside the community center. He wasn't on duty. This visit was personal. Something about his encounter with Angela had stayed with him, and he wanted to understand more about the people she represented, those who worked tirelessly to help others despite facing challenges of their own. He had learned through a quick search that the shelter was hosting a community forum that evening. It was open to everyone, focusing on bridging the gap between residents and local law enforcement. Daniels hesitated for a moment, his nerves getting the better of him. He wasn't sure how he'd be received, but he knew he needed to go. Inside the center, the room was buzzing with conversation. People from all walks of life were gathered: parents, teachers, volunteers, and a few police officers who had been invited to listen. Angela stood near the front, talking with a group of teenagers. She didn't notice Daniels as he slipped in quietly and took a seat near the back. The forum began with a panel of speakers sharing their experiences. Angela was among them. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the microphone, her calm yet powerful presence commanding attention. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "I want to talk about the power of understanding. Too often, we judge people based on quick impressions or assumptions. But if we take the time to listen, to see the person beyond the surface, we can build something stronger: trust." Daniels leaned forward in his chair, her words striking a chord. He thought about how many times he had made snap judgments during traffic stops or encounters on the street. Angela's calm demeanor during their interaction had been a perfect example of someone refusing to be defined by those judgments. Angela continued, sharing stories of the people she worked with at the shelter. Single parents struggling to provide for their children, teenagers like Lisa trying to rise above difficult circumstances, and even volunteers who gave their time despite their own hardships. "We all have a role to play," she said, looking around the room. "Whether it's through kindness, listening, or simply showing up, we can create change. It starts with small actions, but those actions ripple out in ways we may never fully see." The room erupted in applause as Angela stepped back from the microphone. Daniels felt a mix of admiration and guilt. Her words were powerful because they were true, and he realized how often he had failed to listen or see beyond his uniform. As the forum ended, Angela moved through the crowd, thanking people for coming. Daniels stood, debating whether to approach her. He didn't want to interrupt, but he felt compelled to say something. Gathering his courage, he walked toward her. When Angela turned and saw him, her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice warm but curious. "What brings you here?" Daniels smiled awkwardly. "I wanted to listen, to understand more. After our interaction, I realized I have a lot to learn." Angela nodded, her smile widening. "Well, you've already taken the first step by being here. That's how change begins." As they talked, Daniels felt a sense of hope. Perhaps this was the start of something new, not just for him, but for the community he served. After their brief conversation at the community forum, Angela and Officer Daniels parted ways, but the interaction left both of them thinking. Daniels felt a sense of relief. It wasn't just about making an appearance. He had taken a step toward something meaningful. Angela, on the other hand, was encouraged to see someone from law enforcement willing to listen and learn. The next day, Angela was back at the shelter, coordinating a project to create care packages for families in need. Volunteers filled the room, assembling boxes with food, toiletries, and handwritten notes of encouragement. Angela moved through the group, her presence energizing everyone around her. As she packed a box, one of the volunteers approached her. "Hey, Angela," the woman said. "Did you notice the officer at the forum last night? He seemed different." Angela nodded with a thoughtful smile. "Yes, I did. That's Officer Daniels. We had a brief encounter a few days ago, and I think it stuck with him. It's good to see someone willing to take a step forward." The volunteer chuckled. "He didn't just step forward. He showed up in the hardest room for a cop to walk into." "That says a lot." Angela agreed, but kept her thoughts focused on the work at hand. Change didn't happen overnight, and while Daniels had taken a positive step, she knew there was still a long way to go. Meanwhile, Daniels was at the police station, sorting through the day's reports, but his mind wasn't entirely on his work. He kept thinking about Angela's words from the night before. Change starts with small actions. He had seen how much respect she commanded, not because of authority, but because of her compassion and strength. He wondered how he could apply that to his own work. That afternoon, Daniels decided to visit the shelter. He didn't have an official reason to go, but something inside him urged him to reach out. When he arrived, he parked his cruiser across the street and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The shelter was buzzing with activity. Children laughed as they played in one corner, while volunteers worked on various projects. Angela was by the front desk, speaking with a staff member when she noticed Daniels walking in. Her surprise quickly turned into a welcoming smile. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone warm. "Back so soon?" Daniels chuckled nervously. "I wanted to see the shelter for myself, learn more about what you do here." Angela gestured for him to follow her. "Well, let me show you around." As they walked through the shelter, Angela explained the programs they offered: meals for families, after-school tutoring for kids, and job training for adults. Daniels listened intently, asking questions and showing genuine interest. For the first time, he saw the community he served in a new light, not as a collection of problems to solve, but as people striving to overcome challenges. By the time the tour ended, Daniels felt a sense of humility and inspiration. Angela handed him a clipboard and grinned. "You're here now. How about helping us pack some boxes?" Daniels laughed, rolling up his sleeves. "I think I can do that." And so, for the next hour, the officer worked alongside the volunteers. It wasn't much, but for Daniels, it felt like a meaningful step toward bridging a gap he hadn't fully understood before. The weeks following Officer Daniels' visit to the shelter were filled with small but important changes. Daniels continued to attend the community forums, becoming a more regular presence at events where people from all backgrounds came together. He no longer saw his job as just enforcing the law. Instead, he started to see it as a chance to build trust, to understand the people he served beyond their interactions with him in uniform. Angela noticed the change in him, too. He wasn't the same officer she had met during their first encounter. Daniels now greeted the residents at the shelter with a smile, asking how they were doing. He had even started joining some of the volunteer efforts, helping to prepare meals and clean up. It wasn't much, but to the people in the shelter, it made a big difference. His presence there wasn't about authority. It was about being part of the community. One evening, as Angela was finishing up her shift at the shelter, she saw Daniels sitting on a bench outside. He was waiting for a ride, his cruiser parked across the street. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange light across the neighborhood. Angela walked over and took a seat beside him. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," she said, smiling. Daniels turned to her and shrugged. "I thought I'd check in, make sure everything's running smoothly." His voice was calm, but there was a new warmth in his tone. Angela nodded. "It's good to see you here more often. People are starting to notice." Daniels looked out at the street for a moment before speaking again. "You've made me realize something important. What you said about small actions. I used to think that being an officer was all about handling problems when they came up. But now I see that it's about being proactive, about being present and listening." Angela smiled softly. "It's not always easy to make that change. But every time someone like you shows up, it makes a difference. People see it, and it changes how they think." Daniels looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can do more than just show up. I want to be someone who makes a real difference, not just by following the rules, but by making people feel like they matter." Angela could see how much Daniels had changed in such a short time. She knew that this shift in his thinking wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, a journey that had started with their first encounter. And now, Daniels wasn't just seeing the people in his community as cases to solve or problems to handle. He was seeing them as people with stories, struggles, and dreams just like him. "Change doesn't happen instantly," Angela said gently. "But it starts with the decision to do something different. You're already on that path." Daniels nodded. "I know, and I want to keep going." As the sun dipped lower, casting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Angela and Daniels sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. There was no need for more words. The change was already taking root. For the first time in a long while, Daniels felt at peace with the work he was doing. And for Angela, seeing the transformation in him was a reminder that real progress, real change, started with people willing to listen, to understand, and to act with kindness. Months passed since that first encounter, and Officer Daniels had become a more familiar face in the community. He no longer felt like an outsider in the neighborhoods he patrolled. Instead, he felt like a part of something bigger, a group of people who were all working toward the same goal, making their community a better place for everyone. He had learned to approach each day with patience, to listen before making judgments, and to take action when needed, but always with understanding. Angela, too, had seen the changes in Daniels. She was glad to see him showing up at the shelter and community meetings, speaking openly with the people who had once been skeptical of the police. His presence had become a symbol of change. And while Angela knew there was still much work to do, she also understood that the most important shifts often started with the smallest steps. One day, Angela received an invitation to a special community event. It was a celebration of the efforts made by people in the area to improve relationships between the community and law enforcement. The event was going to be held at a local park, and Angela had been asked to speak about the work the shelter had been doing. She agreed, knowing that the message she had shared all these months was one that needed to be heard by a larger audience. When the day of the event arrived, the park was filled with families, children running around, and local businesses setting up booths. Daniels had promised to attend, and Angela was eager to see him there. She had noticed that more and more people were beginning to speak positively about him, but she knew this was just the beginning. Angela took the stage, her heart steady as she looked out at the crowd. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice strong. "It's an honor to be here today, surrounded by so many people who are committed to change. For too long, there has been a divide between law enforcement and the community. But today, we are proving that things can be different. We are proving that by working together, we can create a stronger, safer, and more compassionate world for our children, our families, and ourselves." As she spoke, she glanced over to where Daniels was standing at the edge of the crowd. He was listening, his posture relaxed, but his attention fixed on her words. Angela continued, her voice filled with hope. "The change we seek starts with small actions. It starts with showing up, listening, and being present. And that's exactly what we're doing here today. We are building bridges, not walls. We are working together, and that is what will make all the difference." The crowd responded with applause, and Daniels felt a sense of pride in the moment. He hadn't been the center of attention, but he didn't need to be. The real victory was in the connections being made, the walls coming down, and the understanding growing between the people and the officers who served them. After the speeches, Daniels approached Angela, his smile genuine. "You were amazing out there," he said. Angela smiled back, her eyes bright. "Thank you. But it's not just me. It's all of us. We're in this together." And in that moment, Daniels realized just how much he had changed. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was a part of this community, working alongside people like Angela, who had shown him that true strength came from compassion, listening, and building trust. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a significant step toward a brighter future for them all. The weeks after the community event were full of small victories. Officer Daniels continued to work alongside Angela and others in the community, becoming a regular volunteer at the shelter. His patrols were no longer just about enforcing the law. They were about building relationships and showing the people he served that they could trust him. He spent more time talking with the residents, learning about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. He even started attending local youth programs, helping kids with homework, and offering advice on staying out of trouble. Angela, too, noticed the changes in her community. The atmosphere at the shelter had shifted from one of suspicion to one of cooperation. People were no longer afraid of the police. They were seeing officers as allies, as people who genuinely cared about the well-being of the neighborhood. It wasn't an overnight change, but it was happening. One afternoon, as Angela was working in her office at the shelter, she received a phone call. It was from Officer Daniels. "Hi, Angela," he said, his voice sounding a bit hesitant. "I was wondering if you could meet me. There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Angela agreed to meet him at the park later that evening. She wasn't sure what the conversation would be about, but she trusted him. When she arrived at the park, she spotted Daniels sitting on a bench, looking out at the sunset. He waved as she walked over. "Hey, Daniels, what's on your mind?" she asked, taking a seat beside him. Daniels turned to her, his expression serious but hopeful. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's been happening lately," he began, "about how much I've learned from you and the people in this community. And I've realized something." Angela raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" "I've realized that I want to do more," he said, looking directly at her. "I want to keep working with you, not just in small ways, but in bigger ways. I want to make sure that the people who've been overlooked, who've been treated unfairly, get the support they deserve." Angela smiled, understanding where he was coming from. She had always believed in the power of second chances, and she knew Daniels was ready to take the next step. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've already made a difference. I've seen it, and so have others." Daniels took a deep breath, clearly feeling the weight of his words. "I know I'm just one person, but I want to be part of the solution. I want to help build something that lasts, something that will change things for the better. And I think we can do that together." Angela looked at him, her heart full of hope. "We can, and we will." That evening, as they both watched the sun dip below the horizon, a sense of peace settled over them. The road ahead was still long, but they both knew they were on the right path. Angela had inspired Daniels to become a better officer, and in turn, Daniels had helped Angela reach even more people. Together, they had planted the seeds of change, and that was just the beginning.